very glad to see you all here on Humanities Day. It's wonderful when there's a large turnout, and this is, of course, what the University of Chicago is meant to do, to bring humanities to the world. Mostly, we concentrated on our students, but every once in a while, we get to look at the larger world. My name's Michèle Lowrie. I'm a professor here in classics. I work on really gruesome things a lot of the time. Roman history is full of really nasty stuff. So this talk comes as part of a collaborative project that I have with a colleague who's actually in German. She's in Germany, she is German, but she works on French literature. But we're writing a book together on Civil War, and particularly on the reception of Roman figurations of Civil War and their long history. So at the end of this handout, I'm going to try out a little bit of a reception topic and bring you to a novel by Victor Hugo. I hope you all have the handout. I decided to have a handout as opposed to a PowerPoint so that you would have something to take home with you, and also so that you could read around at your leisure. If I get boring, you can just read the handout. Whereas on the PowerPoint, you have to read what I tell you to read at that moment. All right, so anyway, I'm going to be talking about fratricide. My title is From Fratricide to Suicide, Roman Civil War. Fratricide has become such a naturalized trope or figuration of civil war in Western culture that the strangeness of figuring killing among citizens, which is the condition of everybody involved in civil war, the strangeness of figuring killing among citizens as killing among brothers, which is always going to be a rare occurrence, can just kind of pass by unquestioned. A couple of years ago, I heard a radio announcement by the BBC, and they had decided to call the disturbances in Syria a civil war. This was about a year after violence had erupted. And what they said was that a mother had been found, for instance, I quote, who had sons who were fighting on the two sides. And that somehow meant that they felt that they could actually call this thing a civil war. So the potential for fratricide, didn't say that they were killing one another, but they were just fighting on opposite sides. But it means that there was a potential that tipped the balance in their decision about this disturbance's rightful name. So I'm going to argue that suicide is also a trope for civil war, although it's one that's been much less recognized. And furthermore, that this kind of conceptual progression from violence among citizens to fratricide, and then on, to fratricide, but by that I mean generally violence within the family, on to suicide, and then further to conflict within the soul, is a trope in what is the etymological sense. Now, what's a trope? In Greek, trope means a turn. And this, it's a twist or a turn, and this gives rise to a name in rhetorical theory of a kind of figure. And so Quintilian defines the tropos, or tropos, going from Greek to Latin, the tropos of rhetoric as a change of speech away from its proper context. So the proper context is violence among citizens. The change away is violence among the family, and then the change from that is to violence on the self. So I think there's a clear semantic relation between the various turns in this figure of thought. And we can trace this trope's historical transmission through Latin literature and as well into its reception. So at some point, however, I get kind of beyond the bounds of the classical tradition, which means that I will pass outside my comfort zone and hope that people in the audience have some analogies from areas that I'm less familiar with, because that's what we want to do. We want to find out about things that are less familiar. So one of the things that I've been very puzzled by is how to think about these current suicide bombings. There are many things that are puzzling about them, but what are they what message are they trying to convey? Is this internal violence? Is it external violence? What is it? But back to what I'm more comfortable with. The figuration of civil war through suicide. Well, what is it? It's a kind of cluster of significations that are transmissible, right? They can go from one context to another, and they're adaptable for new meanings under different historical and ideological configurations. As such, this cluster of significations is similar to a concept. It works in a way that's, if you're interested in conceptual history, a big name in conceptual history is this German guy named Reinhard Koselleck. And he talks about how concepts go with a bunch of clusters of other things attached. And they have their histories. So I'm looking in a certain way at conceptual history. But what I'm talking about isn't really just a concept. Suicide itself is one concept, and it can stand for civil war, which is another concept. This trope, but also shares features with the commonplaces, or then the technical term is topoi, which is the Greek word for place. So the commonplaces, which another great German scholar, Hans Robert Curtius, explores in a chapter called Topics. Right, topics comes from the Greek word for place, topos, which is in the commonplaces. In his book called European Literature and the Latin Middle Ages. So whereas concepts can be expressed in a single abstract word, but their history needs to be traced through a kind of network of associations, commonplaces need a full phrase, right? For example, the classical commonplace of consolation, all must die, has a subject, all, and a predicate, must die. And it's frequently expressed with supporting examples, such as, even the mighty Heracles did not escape death, right? So in common parlance, we don't really make a lot of distinctions between these things. We use trope, we use figure, we use topos, we use commonplace, more or less interchangeably. And while fratricide and suicide both belong to the commonplaces associated with civil war, what I'm going to argue is something else, that both can furthermore stand for civil in a process of substitution that makes each one of these a figure beyond the commonplace. So the structural similarity of internal violence in civil war, in fratricide, and in suicide enables a kind of metaphoric substitution. And it binds all these elements in an intimate analogical relationship. So in order to make the point of this paper clear, I'm going to differentiate between a concept, which is an abstract idea, a topos, which is a set of conventional associations, and trope, which is what my real focus is, where an abstract idea can be conveyed by a member of the set of associations. Okay, so that's so much for the rhetorical framework. Now come to the nitty-gritty. Okay, our phrase in English, civil war, it comes from the Latin bellum civile, right, which is conceptualized by the Romans specifically as a war among citizens. So the civile is the Latin adjective civilis, meaning having to do with a civis or citizen. All right, and that stands in contradistinction to a variety of other kinds of internal disturbance. The Romans had many, many, many different ways of referring to internal disturbance. There's tumult, there's sedition, there's war among the allies, which they called the bellum sociale. There's the slave revolt, the bellum servile. Nowadays we have insurgency, we have sectarian violence, we have all kinds of minute ways of differentiating between different kinds of internal violence. So during the civil wars that racked the Roman Republic in the 1st century BCE, depictions of the internal enemy made him in various ways closer than a fellow citizen. A number of basic associations established the commonplaces that in turn enable the development of the trope or figure. So fratricide is conceptually prior to suicide. Now let's look at the handout. My first passage, Lucretius links civil war with fratricide under the larger category of disturbances of the soul arising from his main topic, which is the fear of death. So I'm not going to go into how he gets there, but let's look at item 1. So I'm just going to read the English, but all of you who have a Latin background should read the Latin. Okay, so he says, they amass property with civil blood and greedily double their wealth, piling slaughter on slaughter. They rejoice cruelly in the sad death of a brother, and both hate and fear kindred tables. In the next item on the handout, Sallust hits a poignant note at the close of his account of the Catilinarian conspiracy, when the soldiers go out on the battlefield and then they go out to view or plunder after the rebel army's destruction. So this is item 2. However, many who'd come out from the camp to see or take spoils found a friend while turning over the enemy bodies. Some a guest or kin, and the Latin there is the cognatum. Some also found their personal opponents, and then he has a whole bunch of different, conflicting emotions that one can imagine feeling if you found somebody you knew on the battlefield, particularly if you'd killed him yourself. So Sallust first runs through categories that bring the enemy increasingly close. It's friend, then guest, then relative. With a personal enemy, he retains intimacy. It's personal, right? But he flips the relationship to one of antagonism so that the mix of friend and opponent produces a paradoxical emotional response, which blends opposites, joy and grief, and all those other nasty things. All right, all these relationships and their conjunction with civil war make the point that conflict reached into social categories beyond the political, friends and relations beyond the fellow citizen. In our sources, suicide is first linked to fratricide in civil war as the unfortunate outcome of unintended consequences. So let's look at item 3. And this is from a Roman historian, a Republican historian who exists now only in fragments. And his name's Seneca. He died in 67 BCE. And he tells a story of a brother who killed himself after learning he had killed his own brother in a battle between Cinna and Pompeius Strabo in 87. So the events happened 20 years before. So he was writing, at some point over those 20 years. And so what he says is, for in the battle which was fought against Cinna on the Janiculum, a soldier on Pompeius' side killed his brother. Then once he learned of the crime, his very self. Okay, so there he regrets what happens. Now, this same episode, and one of the things I'm interested in is seeing how these stories are transmitted. This same story is found in Livy, who was writing under Augustus once the civil wars had come to a close. This is item 4. And in this war, 2 brothers, one from Pompeius's army, the other from Cinna's, ran against each other unawares. And when the victor was despoiling the dead, he gave forth a great lamentation on recognizing his brother. Once a pyre, you should add a was in there, was built for his brother, he ran himself through on the pyre and was consumed in the same fire. Okay, so here we have the same story again. It becomes a commonplace by being cited. We get the same story in Valerius Maximus, but he tells it of a different battle. So he says it of Pompey the Great's war against the followers of Sertorius in 77 BCE, and this is item 5 on the handout. Okay, so I'm not going to read it because it's basically just an elaboration of the same thing. A brother discovers that he'd killed his own brother, he builds a big pyre, he commits his body to it on cremation, and so on. It's the rhetorical, filling out of the same story. But what's really interesting is that in all three of these stories, they're told where a commander's name is Pompey, right? Pompeius Strabo, and then it's Pompey the Great. So I think what's happened is that we had a shift of this story from one battle to another, that it's not a historical representation, but rather this idea that in civil wars, this is what happened. And, oh, I know this story about a battle where Pompey was the commander. Of course, it's going to be attracted to the more famous Pompey, Pompey the Great. So I think that's what happened there. Okay, let's move on to Horace. This is really interesting because in the epode that's in item 6 on the handout, fratricide and suicide also come together, but they're no longer one as the result of the other one. Each conveys civil war separately as a concept, and that civil war is never named. He never has the word bellum in this poem. Never has the word civilis, but he has these figurations. So this is where we get the tropes. So Horace was writing during the 30s BCE. Under the triumvirate between Antony Lepidus and the future Augustus. And in this poem, he assumes the voice of an orator denouncing civil war. And he ratchets up the pathos by reconceptualizing the Roman foundation myth about Romulus's murder of his brother Remus as an ancestral curse. Okay, and this is in item 6. After a series of impassioned questions at the beginning, he says, where are you rushing, accursed men? And has too little Latin blood been spilled? After that, he presents an image of Rome perishing by her own right hand, okay? And I've put that in bold. So that's Rome, putting a sword into her own entrails. That's suicide. But he traces the national curse back to the murder of Remus. That's fratricide. So he says at the end, so it is, harsh fates drive the Romans, and the crime of a brother's slaughter, when the blood of Remus, a curse on his grandchildren, flowed undeserved onto the land. The curse in Roman history reenacts the sins of the ancestors. Seneca's tragedy, Thyestes, picks up a fraternal conflict as a metaphor for civil war, and it turns it in the other direction. And in this story, the house of Atreus becomes paradigmatic for violence within the family. So this is one generation, it keeps varying the horrors of the previous generation. We get incest, feeding a brother's children to him, we get patricide, matricide, all in a struggle for rule. Okay, so I have this on item 7 in the handout, and it's just very brief. There's a choral ode in which, it's largely about the mythic story, but then he just drops in civil war. Just now through Mycenae, the arms of civil war have sounded. So here, civil war just becomes a metaphor for the conflict between Atreus and his brother Thyestes. And I think this is interesting because metaphors can go in either direction, right? Fratricide can be a metaphor for civil war, but here, civil war is is functioning as a metaphor for this conflict between the brothers. So if we look back at Horace, the city's suicide is collective, and the founder's fratricide is individual, but exemplary. So both of these things will have long reception histories, and individual suicide is going to join the group. Like Horace, in the Georgics, Virgil several times speaks of fraternal slaughter. Those are in item 8 on your handout. But he doesn't specify the context of civil war. We're just supposed to kind of pick it up. So he says, discord driving faithless brothers. And then the second one, they rejoice drenched in their brother's blood. Since civil war in general is the poem's historical context, he was writing the Georgics, right at the end of the triumvirate and the beginning of Augustus's rule. It seems reasonable to make the link. He doesn't use the word civilis in the poem, but he finds other ways of conveying the concept, such as naming the places where the battles took place. Now, scholars will sometimes disagree about whether the conjunction of discord and brothers or brothers in blood in every instance connotes civil war. But whether you believe every instance does or not, we're now in a kind of literary space where we have to raise the question. So this figuration is now pretty well established. So as with a concept, these tropes, these figurations, have a basis in historical reality. But I think what's interesting is that there's a gap that opens between the actuality and the figuration. And I think if we can focus on that gap, the point where we start talking ways that are different from what's actually happening, we can reach greater insight into the cognitive work that produces commonplaces. And we can understand it better, perhaps, what the culture is doing than we can by just looking at the particular facts. So at Rome, brothers may indeed have killed each other in battle. The anonymity of the stories I gave you in Cicina, in Livy, and then this is also cited by Augustine, makes me a little bit skeptical. Tacitus cites Cicina as a parallel for an event, and this is again anonymous, which is reported to have happened during the civil wars of 69 CE or AD, and this is on item 10 in the handout. And what's interesting about this one is that there's a difference in the brother who is slaying reaction. Here, instead of killing himself or lamenting, he asks for a prize, right? So this is, he's asking for a prize. It just seems like this rhetorical, on Tacitus's part, a way of kind of ratcheting up the impiety. It gets just even worse in the particularly Tacitian way. Now, we do in fact have many stories with names, real names of real brothers that put each other on prescription lists. And during the civil wars. And I'm giving you in item 11 this biting chant preserved in Velleius Paterculus. And this chant was given by soldiers and citizens who were cursing the consuls for triumphing over their brothers, where there's a pun on Germani, which can mean either brothers or Germans. So in 11 it says, "Over brothers German, not the Gauls, do the consuls triumph." And this is a great rhythm. "De Germanis, non de Gallis, duo triumphant consules." So I'd hate to be in that procession, having everybody shout that behind me. The fraternal relation, I want to emphasize, was just one among others, and the way Romans thought about civil war. And that's partly because of the famous antagonism between other family members. Pompey, as a lot of you, I'm sure if you know, had married Caesar's daughter Julia, and when she died, it removed an obstacle to their enmity. And they became one preeminent example of civil war within the family. And authors such as Virgil, and I have this here in item 9, frequently refer to them as son-in-law and father-in-law as a way of underscoring the breakdown in the social bond. And what I find particularly striking about this is that this becomes a standard way of referring to them, even though they weren't related by marriage at the time when they fought. There's something really attractive about emphasizing, the violence within the family, even though they weren't in the same family. So this is, we get something interesting as well as a historical. As historical evidence in item 12, Tacitus again, he actually names some names, and he cites his historical source for another story where a son killed his father this time. So here, the distraught son prays for absolution. He does all a son should do for his father's burial. But an interesting distinction is that he doesn't kill himself, as in the anecdote that we saw earlier from Cicena. And I think this is really the most realistic version of an actual killing of one family member by another. So the point I'm trying to make is that the figurative potential of the broken family exceeds the reality. So variation on this commonplace allows different points to be made. The violation of the marriage bond conveys, for instance, the breakdown in contractual relations, whereas the violence between brothers or between son and father is more an issue of piety. So depending on which thing you want to emphasize, you'll talk about one or the other. Now I'm going to give you some comparative material from the American Civil War, and this is in item 13 on the handout. And these are letters between the Campbell brothers, who fought on the Union and the Confederacy in the Battle of the aptly named Secessionville. And what I find striking is that although it becomes standard in history books or on the web to find references to the Civil War as a battle among brothers, they attest to a lot of surprise on finding the brother on the other side of the line. So I suspect that this means that it couldn't have happened all that very often. So they never actually see each other, much less come to blows, and they learn of each other's presence through intermediaries. They send each other these letters. Their astonishment really kind of marks the coincidence of this happening, but furthermore expresses that things have gone too far, right? So this extreme emotion, I think, energizes the figure, and that's why, brother against brother becomes this kind of tag for the way we still talk about the American Civil War. So as with Pompey and Caesar, the metaphorical aptness of the image of the sundered family as a figure of civil war relies on, but exceeds, the underlying historical connection. The trope recognizes that similarity in the structure of civil war and of broken families attends some kind of contingent association. So if we go back to Horace's poem, Horace stuns his audience by accusing them of violence against themselves. The ancestral curse of fratricide comes as a punchline, revealing the full horror of the violence of like on like, of the cities committing a metaphorical suicide. In his epic and hyperbolic poem on civil war, Lucan, he makes both fratricide and suicide commonplace. And I have some citations in items 14 and 15. So the opening of the poem, that's item 14, picks up Horace's image of Rome stabbing herself with her right hand. And it also picks up the word cognatum from Sallust, right? So the fact that these words are repeated shows that there's a whole literary history here. So I'll read the English. Were wars more than civil over the Emathian plains, and right given to crime, we sing, and a people turned onto its own guts with victorious right hand and kindred battle lines. Okay, now a scholiast on this poem explains that the wars were more than civil because they were between family members. It was father-in-law against son-in-law, sons against father, brother against brother. But we'll see in the poem, fratricide and patricide are really everywhere. In item 15, we have this inflammatory speech by one of Caesar's commanders, under commanders, whose name is Laelius. And he lists the horrors he's willing to embrace. So he says, "Is it so miserable to vanquish in a civil war? By the standards 10 times happy for the camp, by your triumphs over whatever enemy, if you should order me to bury my sword in the neck of my brother or father," and okay, we've got to surpass everything that's happened before, so this is the worst of the worst, "and into the guts of my wife full of child, I will still do it all, though my right hand be unwilling." Okay, so even within Lucan, such enthusiasm is rather extreme. But if we stand back and give a cool analytic look to the hot rhetoric, we'll see that what's happened is that fratricide has become shorthand for civil war. And along with patricide, which occurs no less than 5 times during book 7, which recounts the Battle of Pharsalus. So both fratricide and patricide, are just ways of marking the fact that what he's talking about is civil war. Now, in Lucan, in addition to fratricide, suicide is sufficiently prevalent that it becomes, I think, a figure of its own, or even a whole variety of figures, because we have a slew of different varieties of them. So one scholar working on Lucan, his name is Charles Martindale, declared to the poem, which is called The Civil War, or On Civil War, he says, "It might well be read under the sign of self-slaughter, both individual and collective." So we've already seen that the city commits collective suicide, as in Horace. That's the business of Rome killing itself with the right hand. But even the individual suicides fall into different categories. So one type is the family member who cannot bear to watch a relative die, even without the guilt of having killed his own. And in one place, there's a father who refuses to outlive his son, and he kills himself twice. So first he kills himself with a sword through the entrails. That's the way Rome is killing herself. And then, just in case that's not enough, he also kills himself by drowning. So, this is, at this point, we're seeing this complete rhetorical heightening. Another type is the suicide to avoid capture. And this works according to a different logic, which is suicide to preserve liberty, all right? This is, we'll be getting to the prime example of this, who's Cato, but I think this is something a little different from what we've been talking about before. So we're going to get to item 16 on the handout with this instance. So here's this man whose name is Voltaeus, and he persuades his men, his soldiers, who have all been caught on a raft. He persuades them to kill themselves in a kind of orgy of self-slaughter before the eyes of the enemy as a last gesture of freedom. So fratricide and patricide double the suicide as family members, so to speak, save each other from capture. And what's interesting, if you're thinking about this as a figuration, is that Lucan sort of explains how the trope works. And this is 16a. He says, they enacted the whole crime of the wars on one side, right? So previously it was brother against brother because they were on different sides. Now they're on the same side, and they're committing mutual suicide to save each other from the other side. So here, so Lucan explains the trope, and then what happens with this is that suicide turns the crime of killing the crime of a citizen killing a citizen into one of killing each other on only one side of the Civil War. So what's happening there is that suicide turns civil war within. It turns it within one side, and it also turns it within one family and within one person. So this episode with Voltaeus, it conjoins a number of these different, specific figurations that all kind of overlap one another. So I want to distinguish suicide as a metaphor for the internal violence of civil war, as seen here, from the another figuration which also originates in the Civil War context and also entails suicide, but bears the different message, and that is the suicide to preserve liberty in the face of tyranny. So with that, Cato's suicide at Thapsus becomes the standard model. Now, he killed himself to avoid being captured and also to avoid being pardoned by Caesar. That seemed like a fate worse than death, right? He didn't want to be subject to somebody else's pardon. This is the ancestor of the famous Stoic suicide, which was committed both by Seneca and by Lucan himself when they were caught as participants. Lucan was caught as a participant in a conspiracy against Nero. And that ends up in a really weird situation where we talked about forced suicides. Well, what does that mean then? Anyway, Seneca gives a version of Cato's suicide in his De Providentia, and this is in item 17. And what I find interesting here is that he really jumps through a bunch of hoops to deny that Cato's suicide was in fact connected to the Civil War. And the question is, well, why does he do that? I think it's because he wants to keep the idea of suicide to preserve freedom separate from the idea of suicide as a way of figuring civil war. So in item 17, I've highlighted the part where he says, with one single hand he will open a wide path to freedom. If we continue, it says, this sword, unstained and blameless even in civil war, shall at last do good and noble service. The freedom which it could not give to his country, it shall give to Cato. Who knows? Maybe he was reacting against what his nephew Lucan was doing in his account of Voltaeus and thought, oh wait, he's just piling everything on top of each other. Let's just pull this out and make some distinctions. Okay, so I want to make 2 points. Deriving the meaning of these tropes, these figures, requires careful attention to context. The simple presence of some of the same elements does not necessarily mean that the same figuration is working. Suicide as freedom from tyranny may well occur in a civil war context without standing for civil war in the way that Voltaeus' suicide, which enacts civil war on one side, twists the essential dynamic of civil war, which is violence of like on like internally. But the presence of similar elements may very well invite conflation, contamination. So if both are in operation in the Voltaeus episode, the whole package then becomes amenable to reception. And so I'm going to close by offering you one instance of such reception. So this is Victor Hugo's novel 93, which was published in 1873 in reaction to the slaughter of the Commune. And this novel treats the civil war that broke out in the Vendée and in Brittany during the Terror in 1793. This is why the novel is called 93. So the situation of the novel takes place 80 years before the time of writing, but as I'm sure you all know, there were plenty of internal disturbances in France over the course of the 19th century. So this novel closes with a remarkable scene in which a kind of spiritual father, whose name is Simondin, and his spiritual son, named Gauvin, both die at the same time. And if we thought Lucan had rhetorical fireworks, Hugo, being a romantic, has equally great rhetorical fireworks, but of a slightly different kind of tone. So Gauvin, the son, he kind of enacts a Christ-like self-sacrifice, which is meant to bring in a new world order. It's meant to make the French Revolution really work the way it's supposed to. And his former tutor, Simondin, who is described as loving him like a father, like a mother, and through various complicated plot structures ends up condemning him to death because of his strict adherence to the law. Okay, he shoots himself in the heart at the same time as the guillotine chops off his son's neck, right? So we have this double, this double death. Now, earlier in the novel, Hugo had quoted our friend Lucan, right? And we know that Hugo translated Lucan when he was younger. And so he calls a chapter Plusquam civilia bella, more than civil war, which is a slight readjustment of the first line of the epic, which I put back in item 14, when the Latin is bella plusquam civilia. So he rearranges it a bit. And in the chapter that he calls with this heading from Lucan, we find out that a third character, who's the great uncle of Gauvin, the one who enacts this kind of Christ-like self-sacrifice. There's a fight between the great uncle and the great nephew. So that relationship recapitulates that between Pompey and Caesar, and their relationship recapitulates that between Caesar and Augustus, but their fighting together is like the fighting between Pompey and Caesar. Now, there are many other allusions to Latin literature throughout the novel, but what I want to look at is Simondin's final suicide. So what I think happens here is that Hugo is transferring this commonplace of the brother who kills himself after killing his brother onto the father and son who die here. But furthermore, that the earlier citation of Lucan invites us to see the father killing himself as a figuration of civil war. So as with the Voltaire episode, these tropes, they come in layers. Simondin has his son killed, and he kills himself at the same moment. And those are two different gestures, right? And both gestures figure civil war, killing your family member and killing yourself. So Hugo, in a romantic combination of the sublime and the grotesque, he links together a kind of Christ-like self-sacrifice, ushering in a new world order, with a suicide and a filicide that reenacts all the horrors of the past. The vision of a more perfect future comes hand in hand with an outbreak of internal violence again and again in the historical time that intervened between the novel's dramatic date and its publication. So the novel's ending is kind of an emblem for the whole history that follows. The return of internal violence, the hope always of moving to a new world order. So in conclusion, let me say that suicide for civil war illustrates very well how tropes function. It carries with it a cluster of commonplaces, including the association of fratricide and other intrafamily murders, and conjoins independently existing concepts, suicide, civil war. It is reused as a metaphor because the structure of civil war, internal violence, aptly matches the structure of suicide. In different historical contexts, however, the same trope conveys different ideological conceptions. For the Romans of the Republic, fratricide is the primary metaphor for civil war and brings suicide in his wake as a kind of atonement. Harmony between brothers was an important figuration of a correctly functioning republic. In the French Revolution, fraternité becomes a kind of motto of republicanism. You're supposed to get along with your brother. So then it comes as no surprise that fratricide would figure political violence. With the beginnings of empire, however, suicide comes into its own as a trope for civil war. That's what we're seeing in Lucan. Perhaps because of the greater opportunities for leading private life in that period, right? If republicanism is about getting along with brothers, being an imperial citizen was a much more lonely lonely thing to be. So when a French author, Victor Hugo, looks back to this trope centuries later, civil war itself appears as an ugly Roman inheritance that cannot be shaken, and suicide becomes its grotesque figuration. Now we can open things up to questions.
I'm just curious. 669 BC and the Horati and Curiati, and there's the Sororicide by Publius of his sister Camilla. Would that figure as the same trope for civil war?
There are many more instances of this. So this is the story about the Horati versus the Curiatii, and there are three brothers on the Roman side and three brothers on the side of Alba Longa, and they basically have a duel, a kind of triple duel. And the two of the Romans get killed, and so the one Roman is left facing the three brothers on the other side, and he runs and spreads them out and kills them off one by one. But when he comes home in triumph to Rome, he finds his sister in mourning because she was betrothed to one of the people that he just killed. And so because she's mourning, he then kills her, and all hell breaks loose. And it's a question of, well, is he a hero? Is he a villain? I think absolutely this problem of killing family members shows that there's something wrong. Now, is this civil war? Maybe, maybe not. One of the things that's really interesting in the way that Augustine, for instance, talks about the war between Rome and Alba Longa is that he calls Alba Longa Rome's mother. And so when Rome went to war against her mother, this is looking like civil war. So I don't know that at the beginning this story was about civil war, but it was able through these kinds of associations to become a story that could be thought of within this kind of larger conceptual thought space of civil war. So if we think civil war is just like a citizen killing another citizen, then we're going to have a very narrow definition of it. What I'm trying to do here is to show that these ideas pass over the borders of the strict definitions. And with that story, we're definitely getting that sort of thing going on. The whole issue of the political disturbances being linked to violence against women has a sort of different type of structure. We can think of Lucretia's suicide, where she killed herself after being raped and called for the vengeance of the Tarquins, vengeance against the Tarquins. At which point, we get the foundation of the Roman Republic over against the Roman kingship. Yes.
What bearing can your study of literature surrounding the Roman Civil War bear on the question of whether polities have souls, and what it looks like to be concerned about the soul of a polity?
That's another whole branch of research. Plato in the Republic is the first instance that I know of where there's analogy made between the city and the soul. But if you look at the way that a breakdown in the city occurs, very often there's an emphasis on all of the emotional disturbances that come along with this. So I have Seneca's a bit from Seneca's Thyestes in here. In the choral ode that citation is taken from, it starts off with the description of all of what's wrong with Atreus' soul. He's fierce, he's unyielding, and the miracle is that he's been really nice to his brother Thyestes and given him the crown and is inviting him into a celebratory banquet. And after the choral ode, we find out that he's fed his son to him. But in the meantime, it's an ode in which there's an emphasis a lot on the breakdown and all of the fear that comes with this breakdown in the family, which is then made analogous to civil war. So there's a homology between internal conflict, whether emotional or physical, and what happens with the Civil War. That Prudentius has a poem called the Psychomachia, in which a lot of these figurations come up. I have just sort of saw some things were happening there. I need to work through that material in greater detail. But that's a really important part of what's going on here. Other questions? Comments? Yes?
The citations that you have here, in what respect are they, contemporary accounts of what happened, or is it just sort of nostalgia or lore or fiction?
So we know with the Sisenna that it has to have been written within 20 years of the battle, because we know when he died and we know when the battle took place. So that's within 20 years. Lucretius was living in a time of great, he was writing in the 50s, so this was a time when there had been civil war. Things were kind of brewing for the next round of civil war. Virgil and Horace, the bits that I cited are from the end of the triumviral period at the beginning of Augustus's rule. So civil war is really very vivid. But Horace is looking back to Romulus. So do we really think there was a Romulus and a Remus? I don't know. But at a certain point, this story, began to be circulated that, he'd killed his brother. We think that the whole Romulus and Remus story is relatively old, but it's much older than our sources. So we can't really trace its precise development. But at this period, when they're talking about Remus, it's very hard to argue that there's not some, hint of, brother on brother, killing. At least I think so. Other people disagree with me, but that's what scholarship is about. Yes?
This isn't directly related to civil war, this is more about external war, but
Mm-hmm.
when Romans suffered awful defeats like they did, a series of defeats in the hands of Hannibal or Acari or Teutoburg Forest, did the writers ever become pessimistic and think that their country was in decline?
Well, the poem, that actually all the poems that I've cited here are all grappling with the problem of where the country's going. So, Horace's poetry, speaks to that very, very directly. That Virgil's Georgics is to a large extent about social collapse. Those of you who've read the Georgics knows that it ends with the wiping out of a hive of bees, where the bees have been made a kind of model for society, and they're perhaps a very failed model for society. The society of the bees looks rather fascistic to us, but it is nevertheless wiped out. And the whole issue is, can we restore the hive? Can we restore the metaphor for society? And we have a very complicated ending, to that poem, but that is the issue. So the question of restoring a failed society is very much what Roman literature is about, whether the violence is internal or external. Now, one of the things that you get as a commonplace, particularly in Horace, because it comes up in poem after poem, is that the way to get out of civil war is to wage war on foreign people, so to go out and build empire. So building empire is the solution to internal violence. It's not that we should become pacifists. We're Romans, we fight, right? We just need to go out and fight the other people as opposed to fighting ourselves. Yes?
In a book I read recently, Copper History of Antony, Cleopatra, the author, repeatedly makes the point that the average Roman soldier's first loyalty to his was to the general he was serving and not to Rome. So in this instance, in these instances, would the common soldier, say, feel the same about the conflict going on between these generals? Would they perceive it as a civil war then, or are they just serving such and such general?
Yeah, so whatever you're reading is talking about that period, which was anomalous in the history of the Republic. So it was really very much in the late Republic where we have lots of sources that that the generals would go and fight for a very long time, very far away. And it's during those circumstances that they would develop this kind of loyalty to the individual general. So that's perfectly on target for that period. As for knowing what the common soldier thought, our sources are completely silent on that. You know, we have literature that is an elite literature that's preserving largely the aristocratic point of view. So one of the things that is really valuable about this chant in Velleius Paterculus, where the De Germanis non de Gallis duo triumphant consules, is that this is a popular chant. So this is one place where we can hear the voices that are non-elite voices. Now it's preserved in an elite source, right? But it is still, it's sufficiently, it's not quite metrical according to our understanding of Latin meter, but it is sufficiently rhythmical and follows the rhythmical patterns of what's called a versus quadratus, which is like a squared off, verse. That I suspect that it's preserved verbatim. We have a few bits of literature in the continuations of Caesar that seem to be written by people who were less highly educated than our marvelous Sallust and Livy and those people, and they're the standard language is that it's a civil war. Yes.
It is said that Marius the Great created the first Roman professional army. That might mean greater allegiance to Rome. From that time on, it might not. 103 BC.
So one of the things that Marius is known for is including people in the army who were not landowners. So that is a real extension of the army into a class beyond what it had been before. Yes?
In one of your excerpts from Horace, there's a reference to Parthian vows. Now, did these external enemies predict that Rome was going to wreck itself? The Parthian vows.
So the Parthian. Okay, the vows. I think they're vows to that they will come and destroy Rome. They're wishing for the city to perish, by her own right hand. What we have, it's really not clear what that is. But we have another poem of Horace's where he is basically bringing up. I think it's Hannibal's ghost. And Hannibal is wishing self-destruction on the Romans. So in Virgil's Aeneid, when Dido dies, she curses the Romans and wishes that her descendants, now she's in Carthage, right? So she's in North Africa, she's the ancestress, of the Carthaginians. She's basically predicting that Hannibal is going to go, and destroy them. But what's interesting there is that the violence is, between Dido and Aeneas, it's not about, an external kind of violence. It's very psychological. It's a love story. She kills herself, because she's abandoned for a love reason. But if you think about, that as a way of talking about, the intimate relations one has with the enemy, we can kind of broaden our way of thinking about violence. I see that it's 3:00, so our time together has come to a close. If anybody has questions for me that you want to bring, we can talk informally outside. I think the room is going to be needed they're going to need to set up the room. It'll be needed for the next session. They'll need to set it up. So thank you all for coming.